So, hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Long Road Back, a podcast all about the hidden side of injury recovery to give athletes a voice and ultimately to help people who are going through that injury journey feel less alone. Just before we get started, I want to say a massive thank you to everyone who's shown support for the upcoming online rebuild event that's coming up on the 28th of May, I think. I'm really excited to meet you all, share some more about the key reasons why rebuild exists, and obviously touch on some of those themes such as social media, comparison culture, and all the things that come with injury. So today I'm joined by someone I'm very excited to share their story. She posted actually about injuries on her social media, and I was really inspired to reach out. And as I was saying off air, I was very thankful she said yes to come on to do an interview. So today I'm joined by someone who has previously represented Sale Sharks, Gloucester Hartpury and Harlequins women in the PWR, which is the top flight of English women's rugby in England, not English women's rugby. I'm sure we'll come on to it in a second. Actually has 53 Wales caps, as we established just before coming on air. And if I'm not mistaken, actually used to be a CrossFit athlete and actually ended up kind of falling into rugby by chance. And I've just seen you grimace there, which is quite
Yeah, I mean, I like CrossFit. I wouldn't consider myself a CrossFit athlete to an extent. I go out and compete a lot. I do love the sport, yes, and I will do it in my spare time when I've got a down week from rugby. I have been told off a lot for doing CrossFit previously, and then I've reined it back in. But yeah, loose term, I would say.
No, and I do understand that. No, yes. So I get that. Yeah, say no more. No, I do understand. So how did you come into rugby then? As in, how did it kind of come about getting involved with the Welsh rugby and things?
So I kind of did it a little bit in school, a bit in university, but I actually didn't really take it that seriously, which sounds weird that I kind of just fell into it. But I kind of went to this, I think it was a tens tournament actually, and it was like 20-minute games, and basically got called up from that. Couple of like regional games as well, and then I got into the squad, and I thought I may as well take it a bit more seriously. So I kind of fell into it really. I didn't plan to
I
be
love
here.
stories like that though. Yeah. No, but it's generally, it's amazing how often that kind of crops up. I know from kind of personal experience being at the Uni of Bath when there was the GB bobsleigh team, had quite a big presence there, and some of the lads who maybe used to play rugby but went to the gym suddenly got involved in this bobsleigh program, and then one were competing at the Winter Olympics. So it's kind of amazing how these things kind of happen from there. So how have you found the experience of playing rugby? Obviously going from Sale to Gloucester to Quins, you've quite, had quite experience of multiple different teams in the PWR. How are you finding Harlequins at the moment, and obviously your journey through rugby?
Yeah, to be honest, like rugby just gives you so much, doesn't it? You meet so many different people, like the friendships you make. Each team you go into, you learn something differently. Like you can always take something away from any club you've gone to, like whether it's because it's like a northern team or wherever it is. Like it's been amazing. Like the journey has been amazing. I didn't think I would be where I am now. Didn't even plan to initially be in the PWR. Like I wasn't necessarily someone who had like an aspiration of all these things, and I've kind of fallen into it. But I guess once I started to put a bit more effort into it, you have like different goals, different dreams, etc. But yeah, it's been incredible. Like I've loved it.
That's amazing. Is there kind of a moment that stands out for you? Because obviously at the moment, with the incredible rise of rugby, I'll say obviously in England, but obviously all across the UK and across pretty much the whole rugby landscape, as the women's rugby is thriving at the moment. Is there kind of any moments, whether for Wales or for Quins or the other teams, that really stands out to you?
To be honest, I actually loved my 50th cap, and I know that's a big milestone anyway, so it's quite cliche because a lot of people would say it's either their first or their 50th. But it was just an incredible experience. Like it was the World Cup. Obviously, eyes were on women's rugby.
Yeah, it was. It was unbelievable. Yeah.
A lot of people were watching rugby, so there was a lot of hype around that. A lot of growth in the games. But I think that moment was amazing for me just because the amount of sacrifice you go through being a female rugby player, the amount, like I've quit jobs, taken like 16k pay cuts, I've travelled 8 hours on a training day, I've slept on sofas with friends in random hotels, like missed time with family. And I think getting to that milestone was amazing because of how much you kind of sacrificed to get there. And I think that's why it was like better than my first cap, which you'd kind of expect because you've been there longer. But yeah, I think that was the nicest moment, I guess.
No, for sure. And I think and I've always said this to people, I think rugby requires a very specific type of sacrifice. I think it's the fact that I know there's other sports do this as well, but there is something about rugby, the pure physicality that it brings. That every session you have to be mentally and physically present. You can't switch off even for a second, because that's when injuries happen. That is when incidents happen. I think that everything from the gym, the weights, the robustness sessions, I'm sure, the traveling, all those kind of things, so it's remarkable. And I think 50 caps well is incredible. And I think I'm just building on that, because obviously, as you know, we're talking off air, what I like to do in this podcast is explore kind of elite athletes' understanding of injury and then kind of take the lessons from that. I think it's a really good start point. I'd love to kind of hear from you, probably how maybe your relationship with injury, because as far as I understand, you've just hurt your hamstring playing was it in the start of the Six Nations when it happened?
Yeah, the first game, yeah.
So how did that end up, or how was that going for you?
To be honest, I was really gutted to get the injury. Obviously, you are going to be gutted, especially to be ruled out one of the best campaigns, the Six Nations. I think I haven't played that much rugby this year. So I was really excited, like coming into a team where I know I can play how I want to play, as in I have freedom to do whatever I want. So I was really excited for how the Six Nations were going to go. Obviously, that didn't turn out the way I planned. But I kind of had to remind myself to kind of flip my mentality. And I kind of did that really quickly. Within like 10 minutes, I kind of flipped my mindset and told myself, right, okay, I need to focus on the good things. I didn't kind of give myself time to actually process not what it meant, like coming away from rugby for 6 weeks or not doing the Six Nations campaign. But I didn't want to dwell on the negatives associated with the injury. And I've been through a couple of injuries before, so I've kind of been through that process of feeling really upset by it and focusing so much on what you're missing out on. This time I really wanted to focus on, okay, there's going to be opportunities somewhere, there's going to be silver linings. What can I focus on away from rugby that redirects my focus? So I think that was that was kind of my goal with this injury. And to be fair, it for the first couple of weeks, it really helped just redirect my focus, kind of just shift my mindset away from, well, essentially not being in the team and getting complete FOMO, which I would get, but I kind of tried not to dwell on it. I kind of just accepted the fact that my Six Nations was over, and that's how it's gone.
No, for sure. I mean, it's fascinating for me to hear you talk about that. And just before we come on to that sense of acceptance, which I do think is a really, really important part, I'd be fascinated to hear about that kind of transition from being frustrated to then hopefully that acceptance. I mean, that FOMO must have been really difficult, because I know that for injured athletes, especially in team sports, obviously individual sports missing out on events, but with team sports, from the kind of young athletes I've spoken to, it's almost a sense of almost guilt, and that like we feel like we're letting our teammates down by not being there. But there's also like that FOMO and fear of missing out, because ultimately we're not part of the squad anymore. But then we are still, because the injury doesn't take that away from us. And I'm really interested in kind of your experience of maybe managing that. I say FOMO, it's a great word for it, actually.
So I think for me it was a little different. I went straight back to my club after my injury. So not only was I missing out on games, I was missing out on the environment that I really
Yes.
enjoyed. And, the girls are a big part of Wales. And this year it's been incredible. Like the girls have always been, or at least in the last couple of years, really tight as a group. And it's a fun place to be. And to be honest, we've got new coaches in as well, and we're learning loads. And I was gutted not to be growing and developing as a player as well. But yeah, it was more so FOMO of being away from the girls. Like I basically essentially went from training with a group of 40 odd people, being in and around people, to basically doing everything on my own for the last 6 weeks, which has in the last couple of weeks been really difficult, because it gets to a point where you don't want to do it alone anymore.
No, for sure. And I think this must have been a hell of a transition, because injuries, unfortunately, the way they are, they're incredibly isolating. I mean, how did it feel going from that almost that full noise of environment and then suddenly being on your own? That must have been a really hard transition.
To be fair, the first couple of weeks was actually okay, and I think I redirected my focus to my business, getting more clients, putting more energy into that, and I'm so busy. So in a sense, it's like a silver lining almost, because I've got more energy to put into my business, because I have less hours on feet. But then after about week 3, week 4 maybe, you kind of get not the realization, it is just isolating. And I didn't think, because everyone was telling me, oh, you will feel really isolated, and I thought, no, I think I'm going to be okay. Like, I've you know I've shifted my mindset. I think I'll be fine. And it's only in the last couple of weeks where you actually realize how alone you are in the rehab process, doing everything yourself. You have a couple of touch points here and there with physios, and that's it. And I've been fortunate enough to come back into the Wales camp this week, and I went one day last week when Quinns was on a fallow week, and it was actually amazing. Like, it just changed my mood completely. It was like, yeah, it was just nice to be back in that environment again.
No, for sure. And I can relate so heavily to what you're saying, because it's amazing what that community aspect can do. And I think, as you just mentioned, that injuries are so isolating, because sometimes it's not only the fact that, as you say, you're not on the field. It's actually the things that happen off the field as well. It's I'm not surrounded by teammates. It can be something as simple as going for a coffee, the post-training debrief, the sappuccino, I think we used to call them. And it's like, it's a very real part of sport. And I think for so many injured athletes out there, I know especially the ones I've come into contact, that one of the hardest things they do talk about really is that, that gap between it suddenly, not through a choice you made, it wasn't a decision you made, but by what happened is you're suddenly separated from the group. And I think you touched on it there. How have you what methods have you used to try and, almost counteract that isolation? As you mentioned there that you kind of came into camp. Is that, obviously you said that something that's really helped you?
Yeah, and coming into camp, sorry, did really help me, because it was a changing environment. I've done a lot of, well, I've just been alone for a lot of the time. So seeing the girls, like, they welcomed me really well, and it was a bit overwhelming, but it was just nice to be back with my friends, which is just, you want to, that's what the rugby is. You never really train alone, so that really, really helped. To be fair, there are days where I've struggled to even want to train. Like, I've probably had that in the last week and a half, 2 weeks, where it's taken me a bit longer to get to the gym, or my sessions take me twice as long because I'm really not motivated to do it. But the only thing getting me through it is knowing that it's going to help my my progression. But I'd be lying if I said I haven't been struggling the last 2 weeks in terms of motivation. Like, it's really not been there. But again, you're an athlete, you're disciplined, so you have to do it and you have to get it done. It just takes twice as long.
I really appreciate your honesty with that. I really do. I'm sure the listeners will as well. I think one thing that's so interesting to know, and what I find so fascinating about the young athletes, is that, and obviously people like yourself in the elite environment, is that the physical side generally will take care of itself. The level of commitment you've shown to your sport and your training, the question of whether you physically can do the rehab, that's almost, it's a question, but it's not, probably almost not the most important part. I think you know as well as I do that when you get to the gym, you will do the exercise and you know how much it will benefit your injury. It's almost that mental side of, right, I've got to get to the gym, even though the tangible results of that can be quite hard to see. It's helping your end goal, but it's not. But like, almost, you're not getting those results straight away, and you're like training on your own, almost that isolation. So, I mean, I can really resonate with what you're saying, because I think that mental, I say toll, but almost how it's quite so draining, isn't it? Almost training by yourself all the time.
And I think not only that, but your training has changed significantly. Like, obviously, I've got a hamstring tear, so a lot of the training that I've done previously, I physically couldn't do. A lot of my sessions were adjusted. I couldn't do lower body for a while. All the conditioning is off feet, but I couldn't even do off feet. It was basically just seated ski erg and seated
which
assault.
does get tiresome after a while, I have to admit,
tiresome
even on a practical level. Yeah,
you're using your arms anyway, but
yeah,
that became a bit mundane because it's very repetitive, and you don't get the same effect on your lungs as you would if you were able to full send it doing a circuit or a running session or sprints. It's just a different feeling, so that becomes difficult to continuously do when you're missing out on a different way of working out. Like, I think a lot of players, individuals, if you have a really bad day at work, or you've just had a tough day, or whatever's going on, sometimes you can just full send it on a workout and you feel amazing. But you've just had a bit of a sweat, 30 minutes of, getting outside your head, listening to music, whatever it is, and
Just
it
being
kind of
present
gets
in the
you back on.
moment. Yeah.
Exactly. Gets you feeling good again. Whereas I don't really have that. And I think I don't have that outlet, I guess,
Mm.
because the intensity is a lot different. And that will change. But I have realized that sometimes you do just, people go for 5K runs or 3Ks, whatever. They have that release almost. And I think I've missed that because you're already dealing with not playing and you're watching the girls play. You're already dealing with isolation. You're not with the girls, and then your motivation dips. Your training's different. You can't do so many things. Um, you're gonna get those moments where you just feel like you need to fully send it to get you back on level where you've been before. So yeah, that's been probably my biggest realization from this injury, at least.
And that escape is huge, isn't it? And I think as athletes, and it comes onto the sense of identity, isn't it? But doing sport is what we do. And so when the sport is taken away from you, not only is the thing you enjoy doing taken away from you and a big part of who you are taken away from you, there's almost a double whammy of, well, but also the thing then that I would use to then support my mental health when I then can't do the things I enjoy is also gone. It's
Yeah.
like, it's this horrible double whammy. And that escape, I think, is so true. And I think that there's probably, if you ask, I think most injured athletes would definitely say what is one of the hardest things about not being able to play a sport, and it really is that sense of escape. I think that, not being able to do the thing that, as you say, that things could be going wrong, you could have relationship problems or friendship problems, but that one constant would be, however it looked, it might be your sport, it could be that 5K run. And actually, it's interesting you mentioned that 5K run. Obviously, you would have seen this as well. Obviously, the big surge in run clubs and sports clubs and that kind of that social element. And it comes back to what you were saying about kind of missing out on being with the girls, is that if, let's say, we're in running, it's like, well, I can't go on that 5K. I physically can't do that 5K run. So not only can I not go on the run, I've now got to do my rehab by myself, but I don't want to do my rehab by myself because I want to go on the run, but I can't. And it's this horrible cycle, isn't it? This vicious cycle just going round and round. So building on something you mentioned earlier about acceptance, I think that is such a big part of the journey and also of breaking that cycle. How have you found that sense of acceptance? And as you mentioned before, you had that kind of perspective shift straight away. And then obviously, maybe you find it slightly hard in the last few weeks. How have you found, kind of the whole principle of acceptance during injury?
Do you know what? I think it helps massively once you get that acceptance, once you can shift your mentality or focus onto something else. I think you can just get or more out of yourself, not necessarily the best out of yourself, but you can get more out of yourself in pretty rubbish circumstances, whether that's focusing on spending more time with family, focusing on your business. You're away from family or friends or partners, etc., for a lot of the time when you do have these sacrifices. So being able to accept that and pour your energy into so many other cups that you would only dream of when you're in a campaign makes it so much easier to move past it. And like you said, coming out of the squad and basically going into isolation. So it sounds like COVID. I mean,
It
like
does sound like COVID. Yeah, that's fine. It just flickered
training
across my
by
face.
yourself,
Yeah,
like
quickly
it
move
is
on. Yeah.
anyway. So bearing the weight of like constantly thinking about your injury and what could have been, and you should be there, and what about losing your shirt? All these other worries that could come into your mindset or thought process during that time. It doesn't really help you in the long run. So it makes the journey easier because you are just redirecting your focus, and it is so hard to do. And there's going to be days where it dips, or you need to lean on a friend, or you just think, okay, I can't do today and I'll have to start again tomorrow. But if you had, I don't know, an 8-week, 12-week injury and you constantly thought about the negatives, it's just going to be a horrible process. Whereas I've got to sit through the 12 weeks anyway, so I might as well make them good.
It's almost putting less pressure on yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
I think so. Yeah.
You kind of, I like the expectation to be back for a certain game. If it was a case of I could be back for the final game, there'd be so much more pressure, so much. But because I know that my injury is going to take X amount of time and there's not really any way to speed it up, it allows you to accept it a lot easier.
No, for sure. And I think it's just it's so valuable hearing that, because I'm going to obviously link to social media a bit here, because I think one thing, and I'm very passionate about this, that I think it genuinely gets wrong, is that it emphasizes so heavily this idea of injuries being an opportunity. It's emphasized so massively, all I could see as soon as I liked one thing about injuries, which obviously, given I've started a Rebuild account, is quite a lot of stuff now. It's just swarming of people just, straight back on the horse, and there's no excuses mindset of just, everything's 100 miles an hour, back as soon as you can. And look, I think we both know from going through rugby this idea that, of course, there's merits to pushing through pain. Of course, there's merits to working hard. It's fundamental to our DNA. I mean, you're an international rugby player for Wales. It's fundamental to your DNA, this idea of pushing through pain, working hard. But I also think there comes a time with injury when we have like that sense of perspective needs to shift. And I think what you've mentioned there is absolutely key, that, well, if we can accept this slowly, then we can find out, this idea of what we can do becomes, we can figure out what we can do. Because I think trying to figure out what you can do, it sounds logical, doesn't it? Without accepting what's happened, we're just going to end up burning yourself out. And this idea almost like, I mean, I'd love to hear what you think about this, but it's almost like if you try and do too much too early, almost like, this idea, I'm going to get back as soon as you can, it's probably almost going to put you further back with your injury.
Yeah, you can definitely do that. And the risk is definitely there with the type of injury I have. There is a risk that I could re-injure it coming back too soon, which again has almost put less pressure on me to push it more than I would, because I don't want to risk that happening. I don't want to delay my return any sooner. I think it's difficult because pressure's a good thing. I think it does drive you forward, and it does keep you or hold you accountable to what you're doing. And I think there are circumstances where if you have an opportunity to back for a certain game, you're going to push for it as an athlete. Everyone wants to be playing rugby at the end of the day, or whatever their sport is. But knowing that there wasn't that opportunity has relieved a lot of the pressure. Regardless, I don't want to be rehabbing longer than I have to. So I'm gutted when, there's setbacks or delays in my rehab journey, because, if I can't be playing rugby, I still want to be back to full fitness and doing, being back to normality. My friends are like, oh, we should do this competition, or we should do this. Whereas because I've got the injury I have, I can't do a lot of the things that I would do. Let's say if I broke my wrist, which I have done before in the World Cup games, there's so much training I can still do with a broken wrist, but with a hamstring, especially this injury, it feels like I'm, well, not further ahead, but it just feels like I'm limited to what I can do. So a lot of the things where I get my enjoyment from, satisfaction from, which granted is a lot of fitness things, I'm not able to do, even though I'm now blessed with free time where I can put more effort into that. I just unfortunately can't do it.
No, you're completely spot on with that, and I think it obviously it links back massively, doesn't it, to what we were saying earlier about this horrible cycle where we want to play our sport, but we can't play our sport. But it's like, but sport's what helps me feel happy, and now I can't. And it's this horrible thing, and I think something you touched on there that I find really interesting. I was hearing you say as well that some injuries are different. And that's not to take away. I think every injury deserves recognition, and they're all incredibly important. But as part of that, it's also worth recognizing that some injuries do have different levels of, impact on the individual. And I think what you mentioned there, this idea of the hamstring injury, by the sound of it, that was slightly is more difficult to manage than your wrist. And so you broke your wrist. Am I right in saying it's just a fracture? I say just a fracture to your wrist. Obviously, it's more than just a fracture. How have you found the kind of experience between, I assume it's like more of a soft tissue damage to your hamstring versus the kind of fracture in your wrist?
Well, it's been a lot different. I guess with the broken wrist, I actually played on in the World Cup. So I didn't actually miss out any rugby. It was just potentially playing on it made it worse. The training does change, but it's a lot easier to adapt for a broken wrist than it is a hamstring. So I think this one's definitely, significantly worse in terms of what I have to do to get myself back to rehabbing my injury. For a broken wrist, I kind of just wait for it to be fine, do a bit of mobility, do a bit of rehab. Whereas this one, I progressively have to train to get back to starting fitness. But like we were saying about acceptance before and dealing with injuries, in that first Six Nations game, there were so many injuries and so many players
Wow.
had suffered really bad injuries. I'm grateful that my injury wasn't something that lasts 6 for 12 months, and it could have been a lot worse. When you put things into perspective, I'll take a 12-week injury over anything longer. So you kind of just have to, well, almost remind yourself that it could have been a lot worse.
No, I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because it's almost this double-edged sword again, and this the kind of motto I try and live by with, especially with rebuild and speaking to people and with my own injuries, is that two things can exist at the same time. I'm allowed to feel frustrated, scared, anxious, feeling guilty, isolated, all of these things for my injury. But at the same time, logically, there will be someone out there with a worse injury. Now, what I'm learning more and more is that they're allowed to coexist. They really are. And I think, because obviously, for example, with rugby, I mean, I suppose I did, there's looking specifically at our sport, there's been some horrific injuries over the years. Of course there have. Some really bad ones, of course, players medically retiring on the spot, and there's been all sorts of horrific things. It's the nature of the sport. But then at the same time, wouldn't be fair for me to sit here and tell you, oh, your injury won't matter because, someone else had a way worse one. But it's fascinating, isn't it? But I'm so interesting for me to hear you talk about it, because it's like they're allowed to coexist. And I think it's so fascinating to hear. And actually, if you don't mind, so go on. No, you go first.
Say just on that, you're allowed to feel sad about it. My friends keep saying you're allowed to be sad that you're at the Six Nations. You're allowed to be upset, and your feelings are still valid. It's just trying to process it a little bit better so that you get through it more easily. But you're still allowed to have those days where you feel distraught by it. It doesn't take away from the injury. It doesn't take away from your feelings. They're very much valid. It's like you can still feel those things, but how can you put yourself in a better situation to help?
I love that. I really love that. It's almost like understanding that it's not a weakness. Like it's not a weakness to feel upset by this, because again, let's be honest. Let's go back to this cycle we talked about. It hurts. It really hurts. I mean, for yourself, actually, it's not for you, especially in this context, that it affects not only your sport, the way your mental outlook and things, but also it's your profession. And it's like these things all kind of coexist. So the fact that people do feel upset by injuries, because we do lose so much mentally and physically, it's not a weakness, it's a strength. It's part of this acceptance process. And I think it's really, and I'm so glad to hear you say that, because it's so important for people to acknowledge. I will briefly touch on social media again, just this idea that I think that's what social media gets wrong personally. And I think that's something I'm really passionate about, is the comparison can be both a good and a bad thing. And that when I know there's times when I've seen, I'm sure you know the kind of narrative ideas, the idea of, burn the boats, like lock-in culture, no excuses. And you mentioned there, you played through a broken wrist playing for Wales, and that's the passion you have for your country. And it's that. So of course, no one's doubting that athletes can't push through pain and be determined and keep going. It's when, like you mentioned there, that idea of pushing through translates into you can't be upset, and it's like, well, hang on, I don't think that's quite fair to make that kind of comparison. So that's one thing I really stand for. So I'm really happy to hear you say that. I was actually just hoping, if you don't mind, we talked briefly off air about another injury you had before the World Cup. So not the most recent one in England, the one in New Zealand. Was it New Zealand? I think I know New Zealand, because England lost in the final, if I remember rightly, which is a tough day in the office. Anyway, we did well in the last one though, so that's the silver lining. Back on the topic of injuries, I think what I found interesting to hear you say off air was about you had an injury in the run up to the World Cup, and you fast forward to the end of the story, you managed to make it back for the World Cup and obviously play at the World Cup, which is an unbelievable story. I'd love to kind of explore your mindset in that period, as I'm sure it must have been very difficult getting injured in the run up to World Cup, because was that your first World Cup? Am I right in saying?
It was my first World Cup, yeah. To be honest, I was a lot younger then, so I don't know if my bounce back was a bit better, but it was really difficult getting injured. I'd not really had many injuries before, and I do have quite a high pain threshold. Sometimes when I know things are going to be bad, when I know my body quite well, so I kind of knew it was going to be bad going into the MRI, and I remember walking out and being like, oh, it kind of feels a bit better. But the amount of pain I was in the day before, I thought, I could expect, or my expectation.
Don't you?
Yeah, so to be fair, being delivered the news of what the injury was, it was also a tendon, and the expected return was 3 months, and that hurt because, well, obviously it's 3 months, but it would have been my first World Cup, or it was my first World Cup. So there's a lot more pressure. We spoke about it, whether you're rushing back through injury. When you have something at such a high level, rather than, it's a friendly game, or
it's something you don't want to miss out on. Yeah,
exactly. And I was determined to make it back, and I know you can't say, oh, I'm going to be back from a 6-month injury in 3 months. Like it's not possible. However, I knew that, okay, it could be three months. If I do rehab really well and respond well, it could be a lot less. So in my head, I told myself I'm gonna be back in 2 months. I kind of did rehab well in the past for smaller injuries. So I knew I could bounce back a bit quicker. But to be fair, going through the whole process, you've gone from rugby to basically nothing, no running. The rehab was walking upstairs was the first thing I could do. Jumping, doing like hops on trampoline. So the process itself was kind of slow almost, and then suddenly it turned to me running in the last, well, I don't know, week 6, week 7. I'm not even sure, it was so long ago. But you think the whole time you're never going to make it, and even then you've just been out for however many months not playing rugby, so you don't even know if you're going to be selected, because I did no rugby prior to going to the World Cup, if I remember. So yeah, it was completely different experience than it is now. I guess it was of higher importance, I guess.
Well, I think what really strikes me about that, and there's something you mentioned kind of in the middle there, that it's almost a case where you realise that, well, if I can control what I can control, then hopefully the injury will sort itself out. Because as you mentioned, we can't control how our body reacts to certain stuff and certain stimuli. Because for all we know, when you hops on the trampoline, it might have reacted negatively, and then that's a whole different conversation. But I think that sense of control is so interesting. And I'd love to hear from you kind of how that experience went, in terms of, how did it feel being able to control what you could control? Because I imagine that definitely helped with that sense of understanding that, okay, whether I make it back or not, I can do everything I can to help myself in that process.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing in dealing with any sort of injury is asking yourself whether you've done everything you can to put yourself in the best position. So I made sure my nutrition was completely on point. I didn't miss anything. And I know people will normally not miss things, but I was giving my complete focus and full intensity to my rehab. I knew I couldn't slack off a little bit, or not give as much effort, or miss a couple of reps here and there. I gave it my full attention. So it's almost reminding yourself that if I didn't make the World Cup, and it was because I wasn't selected due to just being out of form or out of favour, or now because my calf wasn't back fully fit, knowing that I've done everything I can to get myself in a position, I can accept that I don't make it because of external factors. But if I had cheated myself out of a spot because, I just missed a couple of sessions, or I didn't focus on my nutrition, I don't know, went out to the pub too many times, all these things that contribute, I guess. So I think that's massive in probably anything, whether it's an injury or not. Controlling as much as you can, asking yourself, have you done everything you can? You can be proud of that, and it's far easier to accept something that's, I guess, out of your control.
No, I mean, it's fascinating to hear for me to hear you talk about that, and I find it interesting to hear you mention about, whether it's injuries or anything else, because I genuinely think, and I kind of, this is something I'm willing to die on a hill about, that I think injuries are such an incredible, I say, microcosm, or this like very clear, like almost symbol of life in general. This idea you mentioned there that, we have to control what we control. We can't cut corners. And unfortunately, like recovery, however much we'd love to, we can't change the way our body reacts to things. We can give it the help it needs, but we genuinely can't cut corners. And actually, when people do cut corners, unfortunately, I have no statistics to back this up, but I imagine that's generally when, re-injury happens, and that's when the likelihood of re-injuring actually increases. And I think that from my experience so far doing this, and hearing you talk about that as well, that the perspective shifts that injury give you, I think, are fascinating. I think just the idea, like you say, well, if I can control my nutrition, then that's what I'm going to control. And for so many of us, I remember I'm in my bedroom here. I mean, after surgery today, on my bed, foot in the air, looking black and blue. That, well, the only thing I could control really was, my diet and things like that. And it's like, that doesn't mean, of course, when supporting my mental health, this idea that if I wanted a chocolate bar, of course I had one. Of course, absolutely. And I think cake was actually my favourite thing, and like sticky toy pudding and stuff like that. But it's this idea that, I know, but you're spot on. And that's what I'm learning so much about this, is that, okay, because I knew I was in the sense that accepting that I couldn't do this exercise, but I could control my diet, try and eat healthy as much as I could. It actually meant that when I wanted to have those things, it made it like, I was like, yeah, of course I'm going to have it, because it's about balance. And you're so spot on about that. And I think that sense of control and not cutting corners, I think, is something that, so many people would be able to resonate with. And just kind of coming to the end here, I think you have the most amazing journey with both sport and obviously mentioning your experience with injury. If you can kind of pinpoint maybe one thing that you've learned along the way that you kind of wish you could tell yourself, maybe it was at the beginning of the World Cup journey, or maybe something at the beginning of your hamstring now. Are there any kind of like key lessons you maybe think you've learned along the way?
Well, that is a deep question.
And I also recognise that you're still in the process at the moment, which I think, I think for me, who's also in the kind of injury process at the moment, I'm almost be quite interested to hear how you kind of frame it.
Do you mean in general, in rugby in general, or through injury?
We'll do both, actually. I think it'd be quite interesting. So injury and then obviously leading into rugby.
So I'll touch on the rugby one first.
I got it the wrong way around.
No, fine. Just on top of
I'm joking.
I think the biggest thing, especially elite sport, and I've learned this a lot through probably the last 4 years, and it's quite a deep thought, I guess, but your value doesn't change, or your worth doesn't change based on someone else's opinion. And I think you'll get that in sports, in jobs, wherever people are. There's gonna be a lot that's subjective. You might not get selected because a coach doesn't see your value or someone else is in favour, but it doesn't change your own worth. And I think that's really important to learn as you go through, your roller coaster. Rugby's up and down. It's not always plain sailing. And I think that's really important, because you can lose a lot of confidence and a lot of your belief as a person, which has a knock-on effect on so many things: how you interact with your friends, how you are with family, how you play in the sport. And I think it's really important to remember that doesn't change, because anything that sort of affects you mentally in a negative way and also causes your confidence to dip, and amongst loads of other factors, can really impact you negatively. So that is probably one of my favourite I've learned across rugby, really, which I think can help a lot of people, actually.
No, for sure. Can I just quickly comment on that, though? I sorry to interrupt you. I think that, I don't know what you're going to say about injuries, but I think that's so true with injuries as well. I think that even from a rugby point of view, kind of extending that you're still an athlete whether you're injured or not. And I think that something that I'm still learning, to be honest, and I think it's important to carry out that these things in a sense of acceptance, and that they take time. They're not going to happen overnight. But this idea that I'm still an athlete, and that sport is still part of me, even if I can't play there right now. And I just think that's a really interesting kind of perspective to have.
I think moving on to the biggest thing injury has taught me, and it's probably feeds into just being a rugby player in general. But I think, I think the biggest thing is not making rugby your complete identity. Which you are an athlete, you are a rugby player, but there's so much more that you offer to people, organisations, schools, whatever it may be. I think it's really important to realise that you do offer a lot more. I think when we focus so much on rugby, and it's amazing what rugby does for us, but it can change overnight. You'll get injured for a really long time, and you feel like your identity is just rugby, and it's almost like taken away from you. And I think that can be really hard to navigate. And I think what I've learned, even opening up my business, it really helped me find a new purpose and almost split my time between rugby and other things that I am also good at and enjoy. And I think that really helps, taking away from the thinking that you are only a rugby player because that is your job in a sport that you play, but there's so many other things that make you you. And I think is really important for people, especially in female sport. Find things that you do enjoy. Don't make rugby your entire identity, because it's one day it will come to an end. We all have to retire at one point, and to be able to navigate that time, which is, you've literally gone for an amazing high, you're gonna hit that plummet because it is just a sad time, but you're almost like protecting yourself for moments like that. So I think that's very valuable.
Well, look, honestly, Lisa, I think that perspective that you are more, to be honest, I think sums up such a great way of kind of the whole conversation we've had. I think everything from that acceptance to that cycle, that I think also we have to take that step and recognizing that, and look, as we said, it doesn't happen overnight, but it's one of those things that, you know, you are more than this. I think quite, you know, whether it's your business ventures or your family, your friends, relationships, whatever, I think there's the idea that you are more than your sports, because the horrible reality is sport can be taken away. As you know, I think we're good examples of unfortunately, of that happening to some degrees. Well, look, Lisa, thank you so much for coming on. Honestly, I really do appreciate it. I think the people listening will really resonate with you, and some amazing insights from, you know, top professional like yourself in terms of, you know, that sense of that cycle and that acceptance, you know, navigating injury. So thank you so much. And yeah, I wish you all the best with your hamstring injury.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.